Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Barb Tyson, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Salty Dog webinar. With us today, we have Behan and Jamie Gifford from Sailing Totem. They'll be presenting a great topic, safety at sea, dealing with stressful situations. And as always, before we get started, please keep muted, keep video off, but we do have that chat box open, and Behan and Jamie encourage you just to write your questions in as you think of them. So go ahead, don't wait to type them in. And as always, we're going to record the webinar. I'm going to send out a link to everyone who's registered. That way you can review it if you're here today, and those who can't join us live will get a chance to see it. So let's go ahead and get started. Take it away, Behan and Jamie.
Thank you so much, Barb. We are very happy to be here, support Salty Dog Sailing Association, and part of your awesome webinar series. And like Barb said, everyone, please feel free to put stuff in the chat as we go. Sometimes we might cover it later, and we'll hold off. But we want to make sure that we can try to address questions people have, and that's a really easy way for us to manage it. I'm going to share our screen here and let you know as well that while we don't have a data-intensive seminar today in terms of content on the slides, a lot of it could be really helpful for leading you through the material later. So we are making a copy of these available, and the link to download them will be on the very last slide, so that you can reference back later and think about what you learned and what you're taking away from the class today. It's a little different. If anything. It's a little different than the usual safety at sea, though, so it could be useful.
It is. Should we start?
Let's start.
Just a little bit about us.
There we are.
There we are. So before we were sailing as a family, I grew up sailing in Connecticut. Started, I guess, about 50 years ago, and along the way became a sailmaker and raced professionally, and a few experiences on some pretty interesting boats. But then more importantly, as a family, we set off from Puget Sound in 2008, and we did this.
We did this thing.
And we're still doing this thing. We're on Totem now in Mexico.
If you can see my mouse, we're actually all the way up, kind of above that line there, just about in Arizona. We're as far north in the Sea of Cortez as you can go, which is a great place for hurricane season. Really safe here in Puerto Penasco, and there's a shipyard that's both capable and lets us DIY a lot, as we like to do.
As long as you're okay working in 110 degrees.
It's going to be a little bit toasty.
All right, let's jump in here. Reality check. So at this point, I know everybody got the memo about preparation for the class. So if at this point you want to put on your foul weather gear and get your life raft, and we'll jump into the pool now and inflate the life raft and try and climb into it with our clothes on. Or we can go about this a different way.
Let's do it differently.
Let's go differently. So a lot of classes are like that. This is a different look at safety at sea.
And they're valuable classes.
They're great classes.
Not to downplay how incredibly profound it can be to feel what it's like to jump in a pool while you're here.
Yep. What's important, I think, to point out straight away is that the guys and the men and women on big ships, commercial ships, naval ships, military, they are professional mariners. This is what they do. They've trained for it for years. They go to school, they're educated in this, and they practice a lot, and they have resources to practice a lot. And that's great. We like them to be good at what they do. We all like to be good at what we do, but we're still, in reality, most of us amateurs. And there is quite a big difference between our ability to practice and our ability to train. We don't have the same resources and facilities that they do on big ships like that.
We don't have annual certification or biannual certification requirements to get re-informed and stay up on the latest.
Yeah. So as good as we all think we are, I think there's always room to remember this this fact and to use that as maybe a driver to keep wanting to learn more. Because at the end of the day, when you get out there, when you really get out there, the rigger who inspected your rigging the year before isn't with you, and the sailmaker and the diesel mechanic and the fire extinguishers that are maybe charged properly, but when was the last time you really checked? All those things, they're really on you, and that's what it's all about. So stepping ahead, this is about how we can make better decisions as cruisers out in exotic places. I think it's helpful to start into this to look at some examples of unsafety at sea. A simple reality is that most safety at sea issues have at least part, if not a majority of human error involved in it. And so we're all faulty. I've made a million mistakes on a boat, and I'm going to make a bunch more. The important thing is that we learn from them. But let's look at a couple of unsafe experiences. So underprepared. In this story, we were in Panama and a boat was there preparing to go through the canal as we were, and they were going to head west off to French Polynesia. And the night before, the afternoon before they were going to go to through the canal and then depart and go, they asked if I would do a rig inspection. I'm a rigger also. And so I said, sure. So I came by and got into the rig inspection. And I noticed that the rigging, I didn't find any showstopper items, but a lot of it wasn't brilliant. And unfortunately, the sun was going down and ran out of time before I could go up the mast. So it was just a deck level rig inspection. And they thought, you know, we had it inspected a year ago and it was all good. So we'll just go with that. So they left the next morning and got through the canal, went through the other side, watched for weather, got going to Marquesas. And about 2 days in, this happened. The D2 shroud on the starboard side, the one that diagonally goes into the upper spreader, failed. And
Result, noodly rig.
a very unstable rig offshore at sea. And so when it happened, they sent I think, iridium text and said, this just happened, what do we do now? And so we helped them stabilize the mast, and they were fortunate to make it back without losing the rig. They ended up spending about 3 weeks going through the process of speccing out, ordering, getting shipped rigging in, and then doing a DIY rigging job. And so they left maybe a month late, but they got there, and they got there safely. And the message is here that that we can't just let these things go, and there's a voice in the back of your head. I'm sure they were like, you know, we should have a rigging check one more time, but it was just a little bit too late to do it thoroughly. So when that voice is there, it's there for a reason. It's telling us we should be a little bit more diligent. Engine maintenance, whatever it is, electrical tune-up, sales, it's better to take a little bit of extra time and ensure that you're going to get there without drama. When we crossed the Pacific in 2010, we saw at least 15 boats that were dismasted. And it's not such an uncommon event to have that happen. So the next story is the failure to see risk, and this is a tragic one. When we arrived into Vanuatu in 2010, this boat in the foreground was being towed in, and it was a little odd to see a cruising boat towed into a place like Vanuatu, and we wondered what the story was. And we learned a couple days later that the owner and his girlfriend went out sailing, and they were just going to a nearby island, just a day trip. And underway, underway, they were towing the dinghy. It got a bit choppy, and something went wrong, and the dinghy was struggling. It was taking on water or something. I don't know exactly what happened. But the guy went back to fiddle with the dinghy, and he slipped and he fell overboard. He was never seen again. So in this moment of an emergency situation, this is one serious thing to have to deal with. But it went into a crisis from there. It cascaded. What happened was his girlfriend wasn't a sailor. She hadn't been on the boat. She didn't know how to do anything. The autopilot was on, and the boat was sailing towards the island. She didn't know how to turn it off. And so she kept sailing towards the island, and he was gone. But the problem was now that she was still sailing towards this island, surrounded by a coral reef. And And she was very, very fortunate that Vanuatuan fishermen saw this boat with a crazy, hysterical woman on it sailing towards the coral reef, and paddled over and were able to jump on the boat. And they figured out how to stop the boat to prevent it from ramming on the reef and losing the boat, and who knows about her. So the point is, sometimes safety at sea issues start from the most simple little events, like towing a dinghy and having it struggling because of a sea state change, or maybe the line was chafing or caught on something, or who knows what. And after this event, we learned about it. When we're offshore, I always say, and I still do it to this day, when I'm getting out of the cockpit to go reef or to go check something, I always say, is this the last time I leave the cockpit? And what it makes me do is, if it's anything other than a really nice day, is it makes me clip in. Everybody's got their own life jacket and tether policies and stuff, but it makes me stop and go, okay, I'll go through that extra step. And bottom line is, simple things can cause terrible outcomes. So the point is, we're only human. We make mistakes, simple mistakes, and unfortunately they can end badly sometimes. And I think it's helpful in safety at sea to understand some of our lesser traits, questionable traits anyway. So next one. So one of them is how we respond to situations. And one of those slices of that is, in a stressful situation, do we feel fear, or do we go beyond fear and reach a panic state? I think fear is great. Fear is that little voice that's saying, this is a problem. We need to slow down and think about what we're doing and proceed with caution, or stop, or whatever it is. And it should do that. Panic is a different problem. Panic is fear that is starting to spin out of control, and maybe you lose reason and ration and how you're going to respond. And the difference between them is subtle, but it's meaningful. And here's the important part. If you have panic responses, that's okay. It doesn't mean you can't be a boater. It does mean that you need to learn about this. And maybe it means you need to find a way to, find your happy place in that moment, or defer the management of the situation to somebody else that's in the crew. It's more important to know and accept that you have a response like this than it is to ignore that outcome. This picture was in the Bay of Bengal on our way to Sri Lanka, and we looked over. I was down below and saw the radar, and this teeny little radar speck of nastiness.
On an otherwise fairly clear day, it looks like there's some high level.
Totally benign day.
Here. But yeah, it's a very, very mellow day. In fact, no wind. We've been motoring most of the way from Thailand because there was no wind.
And then I hopped up to see what this little mini squall is, when it was this massive water spout.
And then there was another one.
Biggest one we've ever seen. Then there was a couple more followed, and
we ended up with 4 water spouts in sight.
Yeah, sails down, motoring in the opposite direction as quickly as possible because they're unpredictable. Bordering on panicky, but kept it in perspective. Okay, so another human response is fight, flight, or freeze. Fight or flight is a common one. Do you like, I've got this, I get the situation, I can just jump in and I'm good at managing it? Or do I'm mentally gone, I run away from the situation when it gets stressful? And some people just freeze, literally lock up. In this story, we were actually new cruisers at this point, Catalina Island off of Southern California, only about 3 or so months into cruising.
Avalon Harbor.
Avalon Harbor. It was early in the morning. We woke up, we're having coffee, and we heard this big crashing outside.
Now you can see from the screen here that Avalon Harbor, it's sort of like being at a drive-in movie theater on your boat. You're parked in formation, and although you can mostly just see the mooring buoy marks off of the bows of the boats, there are 2 of them. There's one at the bow and one at the stern. So you're really pinned in place as opposed to doing any kind of pivoting around.
And the crash we had heard and all ran up to the cockpit was about a 55-foot power boat that had dropped their moorings and started motoring, and then their steering controls were lost. Apparently there was electronic steering control that failed. And the boat scraped along the back end of a big sport fishing boat and tore off the swim platform.
So this boat is continuing to progress down the fairway, but not in the middle of the fairway, right down the side where boats are and hitting them one after the other.
T-boned about a 55-foot big power boat.
When it reached the end, yeah. And that kind of spun it around so that it literally made a U-turn and started coming up the fairway behind Totem.
And then it hit another boat, a little boat, shot it out of the water, and then it spun and was pointing directly at us. So we had 3 little kids on the boat, and we're in the back of the boat, and everybody in the harbor on their boats is watching this thing with jaws on the side deck because we're all in shock. And this thing starts pointing towards us. And in this moment,
this is when I discovered that my response is flight. Flight with a dose of panic. And it's a good thing to know about yourself because it's allowed me to work on it. But I was quite panicked that we needed to get off the boat, get the kids in their life jackets and run up to the bow and get into the water and get away from the boat. This is actually not a great course of action.
Behan said, let's jump in the water. I said, no, let's not do that yet. And my response was less panicked, but it was also not brilliant in hindsight looking back. The boat was coming towards us, and we're very fortunate. And as it started progressing, I think a stabilizer on the boat caught one of the mooring line, and it caused the boat to load up and pivot. And then it pulled free, and it passed us at about 4.5 to 5 knots, about 4 feet behind Totem. If it hit us, this big, huge power boat would have gone over the back end of our boat, and that would have been the end of the cruising.
It was literally about a boat length further from us and in the clear of the fairway at that point, where actually the incredible harbor patrol in Avalon, absolutely amazing professionals, they've gotten on board, jumped on, and were able to I think they disconnected the fuel hose so that the boat just was dead in the water.
The interesting part was that the people on board the boat, there was a man, and he was literally statue, stone solid, not unmovable. He was frozen. There was a woman holding a baby that was kind of running around frantically, and there was a dog that seemed pretty excited about the whole thing. And it was really a big hint into how we respond differently. And again, the point is that whatever your natural response is to something, it doesn't mean that you're not viable for cruising. It means it's something to work on and be aware of and know and talk about with the other crew members to see, okay, who has the better managed response to say, okay, you're panicking a bit, just sit down for a moment, we'll deal with it. But awareness is super important with how we respond to stressful situations. Another one for humans is, faulty humans, is confidence or arrogance. And this is another tragedy. It had to do with this wooden tall ship, the Bounty, that had been in a shipyard for a long time. I think it happened 5 or 6 years ago, I should know, or 2012, there it is. And they were in a shipyard for a while. They were gonna head down to the Caribbean. They were running late, and a hurricane came up. And the captain said, basically in the crew meeting before departing, that he said, I've seen worse than this. I've been out in worse than this. We can do this. And then he asked everybody to give their report of their area of responsibility. And they all just kind of acquiesced to the captain's kind of domineering way, is what this Coast Guard report found. And in reality, the engineer said that there was problems in the engine room. It wasn't clean, stuff that ended up clogging the bilge pumps, things like that. And knowing the difference between confidence and arrogance is super important. There's a big difference. Being confident about a situation is great, but if it means that you believe you can't fail, then you've exceeded what reality is. And we've come up with an expression on Totem that's look in the mirror, and if you see signs of arrogance or ignorance, polish until gone. And it's ditch the arrogance because it doesn't have a part. Tired or fatigue, this is a really important one. Fatigue causes lots of problems when you're out on passages. And we all get tired when we're fresh into a passage. That first night out can be a little bit tough, or seasickness can be a little bit tough on people. But it's so important not to slip past tired into a state of fatigue where you're mentally fuzzy, where your legs may be wobbly, where your eyes maybe don't focus in the same way. If you feel any of these things, if you struggle to complete a sentence, or somebody on your crew is doing these things, it's a time to get that person more sleep. And it can even be if it 15-minute increment is a huge impact to restorative sleep for the short term. So big difference here in knowing the difference between these. Are we communicating? This is so important. As somebody who used to race on sailboats, crew communication and going into mark groundings and sail changes was super important, especially at a professional level. And so we did it a lot. And when I got on so many different boats, I had the good luck to get on a lot of different boats sailing, I'd see how different communication was. And you can tell it's how clear it is and the difference it is when crews really communicate well, or it's one person who's sort of like, I've got this, you guys do that, and there's no back and forth. And what it does to a crew, if you're a crew member and the captain is sort of domineering or dismissive of the other way people are talking, then it doesn't make them want to volunteer information. We've had times cruising where our little 4-year-old said, I hear something funny or I see something out there, and we're like, are you sure you see? And then all of a sudden this long line with a little tiny plastic float would pop up in front of us.
She happened to have the sharper eyes and was able to identify it. And because we didn't dismiss her, voiced what her concern was. And yeah, she probably saved us a whole lot of heartache that day. They were not fun conditions. And had we followed our prop on that long line, which Jamie and I truly couldn't see, it could have been a real problem. It wasn't what you'd call a lee shore, but there was basically nothing but deep, deep water right until there was a reef.
With a huge line and lots of fish hooks hanging off it. Communication is so important. So even if you know much more than the other crew members, it doesn't mean that they can't have valuable input. So encourage communication by everybody. And what this comes down to is that it doesn't matter how much you know, there's a lot of other variables that come into the outcome of any situation at safety at sea. Safety at sea is so much about feeling, it's seeing, situational awareness, picking up on an elevated risk situation, and then dealing with it before it becomes a bigger situation. And all these other things, how we respond to stress, awareness, clarity, energy level, all of that comes into play in what the outcome is. So let's just all accept that we're all faulty and make the best of it. All right.
That awareness, though, is really important, though. And I think putting names on our human reactions to things helps us figure out how to mitigate them once we know the way that we tend to respond. You probably know how you tend to respond already.
Yep, it's true. And use that. And again, it doesn't mean you can't go cruising if you don't have the best response. Many of us don't, but it just means awareness and how to deal with the situation. So we have something that I call boxing the problem. And this has to do with usually when something happens on a boat that doesn't go well, it happens as a single point of elevated risk or a small emergency. And when it goes bad, it's because the problem wasn't boxed or contained. It was allowed to spin out of control. And there is a vast difference between an emergency and a crisis. The situation where the guy fell overboard in Vanuatu, that's an emergency. That is a fixable problem, though. And of course, it's super stressful and it's a terrible situation none of us want to be in. But at that time, it's still a fixable problem. When you end up with multiple problems, cascading problems, dealing with 2 or 3 or 4 problems or emergencies at the same time gets so much more complex to deal with it. How do you focus on one thing? It's distracting, it's debilitating. And so no matter the situation, the first thought should be to contain this one situation. Sometimes a whole bunch of things happen at once, but mostly it's one thing, and we want to keep it as one thing. That's the emphasis. All right, so here's an example of an unboxed situation. The picture is of the same area in Malaysia where we were, but it's not of the event. We learned about this from this Aussie couple telling a story how around a Barbie one night, their story, And they get chuckling. She gets chuckling, and she says,
So we all know this turned out okay.
yeah, they both lived.
But
So they were sailing along, and they see a squall coming, and he went forward to reef before the squall hit. And they didn't have roller furling; they had a hank on sail. And so he's getting ready to change the sail or drop the sail or something. And the halyard gets away from him, and he skies the halyard. It goes out and then all the way up to the top of the mast. Okay, not a big deal. But he decided that he was going to deal with it in the moment before the squall hit. So to do that, he had steps to go up the mast, and so he starts climbing up to the top of the mast, and he gets up there, and the halyard had gotten wrapped around a little bit, so it wasn't a quick up and back down again. It took him a little bit longer than he expected. He's holding on, and of course, what happens? To nobody's surprise, the squall hits, and he's up there, and now a big blast of wind and then rain, and you can't see, and he's getting the thing untangled. Well, the situation gets a little bit worse because in the squall and the bigger sail up still, they were dismasted while he's at the top of the mast. The mast goes over the side of the boat. He lands in the water, and as happens with mast and rigging that's come unattached, he gets tangled up, and he starts getting pulled down with the masthead going underwater in a squall. This is about as bad a situation as you get. Fortunately, he's very lucky that he was able to free himself from that situation, get back to the boat, pull himself aboard. They let the squall get by. The boat wasn't holed, and then they cut the rigging away, and then got in.
just so many things wrong in this cascade, right?
We're
It's,
just like shocked at this story, and they're telling it. And then she starts laughing, and she says, as she's probably said 100 times in the story, and you're such an idiot. If you do something that stupid again, I'm leaving you forever. They had a good sense of humor about it, but it's such a simple example of how he didn't have to go up the mast in the moment. He could have dropped the headsail, he could have dropped the main to reduce sail area. So a simple, minuscule problem that was uncontained and allowed to become this cascading effect, where it could have easily had a very different outcome. Here's the story of a situation that started off unboxed and then got contained. This was when we were in Chagos Atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean, uninhabited, nobody anywhere near that except for the 7 or so boats that were in there anchored and moored.
If you dropped a pin in the center of the Indian Ocean and decided to center your Google Earth view around that, you'd see water in every direction. Our nearest shipyard was about 1,000 miles away in the Seychelles.
Stunning place, and
spectacular, beautiful corals outside, inside the reef, very sharky.
Very sharky, yeah. And as is common in this type of place, there's squalls all the time. And at about 4 o'clock one morning, the squall hit, and instantly up, and I was on squall watch. We were on a mooring that was put in by cruisers in the past, a mooring that we had checked. And I'm sitting in the nav station, listening to VHF, watching the chart plotter, looking at AIS signals. I had radar on, the full deal, so I could see what was going on. And then a voice comes across the VHF, and it says, "I don't know what's happened, but we're on the reef." And I knew the voice, so instantly I knew who it was and where they had been on a mooring, and apparently they broke free from the mooring. So I woke Behan and I woke Niall, our son. I'd been then managing the comms and the nav station, and Niall and I got in the dinghy in the squall in the pitch black. One other boat responded. None of the other boats in the anchorage had their VHFs on, which was shocking, because a VHF is a communication tool that we should also, when we're cruising, have available. It's an important tool. But we made it over to this boat. A little while later, the other boat made it over. You can see in the foreground of this picture that dark shading is coral.
Let's see if I can mouse over it, but there, spots like that, and here and there.
Yeah.
That's coral sticking out of the water at low tide.
It turns out the boat went about a quarter mile over a coral reef.
And these coral heads are massive. I mean, they're 100 feet across.
Yeah. We were able to, or when I arrived, the owners were in a complete state of shock. One of them was running around the boat in a towel, and the other one had eyes like saucers and completely shocked. And then one of them went behind the wheel and started full throttle and reversing and stuff. And I was on the side of the boat with our dinghy with our son trying to tugboat them off of the coral, but they were not listening, pouring rain, windy, and hit coral. And at some moment I just yelled out, stop. I knew that they were completely unable to control the situation. So I took over in the moment. And they then fortunately just started listening to commands. And we were able to push the boat off the coral and keep it from bashing in. The short version is.
So that Jamie and another cruiser who weren't in shock over the situation could bring it back into the box, basically.
Yeah, we launched their dinghy, and then we had 3 dinghies tugboating the boat out away from the coral and just containing it in a safe place so it didn't get holed. We stabilized it until light. We got more boats, 12 hours, and everybody in the anchorage later. We got it back out to deep water with a damaged rudder and a bent propeller shaft, but it wasn't a wreck on the reef, which this island atoll claims every year.
Literally to the point that in order to have legal permission to enter the atoll, to get a permit for the atoll, you must demonstrate that you have wreck removal insurance, because they wanted to stop the pile of boats that were actually ending up on a reef.
Yeah.
It is a place to take very, very seriously, and to, well, check the mooring line and make sure that you're going to be secure.
A number of mistakes here, and again, we all make mistakes, and hopefully we learn from them. But the big one is, it wasn't that I have that presence under stress. It's more how badly things can go if you're not aware of how you respond to stress and how you deal in these situations. If we or other cruisers, calm cruisers, wasn't there, and I've read other stories like this, same sort of deal, squall in Anchorage in the middle of the night. It took calm cruisers from another boat that managed the situation. They kept it from going worse. But it's a good example of how a situation is going badly can get recontained again before something worse happens, before an injury happens, before another event. And the next one is a good example of a box problem. This is friends of ours. This is in the Western Pacific Ocean, going to New Caledonia, and the boat was called Quarter Moon, and it was shortly after this renamed Quarter Mast. And
As you can see, or if your screens haven't cut it off, at the very top here of a boxed, there's no more mast at that point.
Yeah, and the story with this is that it was a very sporty passage. We were about a day behind these guys. We ended up pulling into a different island group short of the destination to hide out from weather for a couple of days. But they were underway, and they lost the rigging. Tie rod for the windward shroud let loose, and and the way that worked is all the load then went to the deck on the boat, and it ripped a huge hole in the deck, and they lost the mast over the boat.
In gnarly conditions, in New Caledonia, in the dark.
Yeah, and a British Aussie couple on board.
Actually.
Near a past, yeah. And this was a tough situation. It was big waves. They were taking on water through the hole in the deck. They had rigging over the side of the boat. And what they did brilliantly was to assess the situation, figure out priorities to each of the different problems. So this is a crisis. These are multiple emergencies in the same situation. The boat's pitching around like mad. And the first thing they decided to do was to stop water coming into the hole in the boat. And it was simply a matter of grabbing some cushions below, big cushions, and stuff them up through the hole. Didn't stop all the water, but it greatly reduced it. So they weren't going to quickly get to the point where they were low in the water. It happens startlingly fast if you're not aware of that. The second thing was to get rid of the rigging. But this is a super precarious thing to do. The boat's pitching, there's wires moving and shifting. You want to make sure the mast is not going to bash through the side of the boat. But they did this. They had an angle grinder, and they were able to go around selectively and carefully without any injury, cut the shrouds free in a way that it then went free and clear over the side of the boat. Then they were able to validate that there are no lines stringing behind, and they motored the rest of the way in. So this is a brilliant example of boxing a really bad situation and not letting it spin out of control. Could have easily turned out somebody gets injured and then the other crew members focus on the injury and you're not able to keep the mast from banging into the boat. It doesn't go well from there.
Spiraling. Yeah.
So that's boxing the problem is what I call it. So responsibility or responsibility. And let's look at this a little bit. So with ability, at all of our varying abilities, they come through both intellectual understanding, reading books, taking classes, things like that. And they also come from skills development by actually sailing in the Sydney Hobart race when it's blowing 60 knots and a spinnaker up, for example. All of these things collectively.
It's a classic picture, but it's
Yeah.
a sail.
I designed the
design
mainsail
way
a
back
long time
when.
ago. But all of these things combined equate to our ability, plus other experiences in life, whether you have EMT training or you're a pilot and the plane can be on fire and you're as calm as can be, or whatever those training things are, they all play into what your abilities are. But there's a way to help bridge these sides and to improve your abilities, your response to things. If you're new to this and your abilities are below where they will be in a couple of years. So these are procedural responses, procedures. And there's different types of procedural responses. One of them is training and practice. This is the man overboard drill that we do. This is the life raft drill we do in the common safety at sea class that happens that I joked about. Valuable stuff. And the value and the benefit of this is there is no better teacher than experience. To go through things, even if it's a drill, you learn and see and understand things better than if you can't do that. The problem with it are the limitations for us as amateurs. We don't have the resources usually to do this once a year or to be tested on it a couple times a year to know that we still know how to go back and pick up the fender that we dropped over for a man overboard class or to inflate a life raft. You don't get to do that very often. It can also be that these are scary. They can be intimidating. If you're go to firefighting training on a boat, there are these facilities you can do that, and they're in a container, and it's scary stuff. And you can't train for everything. You can't train for a dismasting. You can't train for losing a rudder or so many things. So while this is highly helpful having this type of practice and trained experience, you can't do it for all things. So let's hop ahead. So this is an example of what you might do in a safety at sea class, and it's great, and it's fun to learn how difficult it is to climb out of the water when you're soaking wet.
Tell you what else it is. It's great to actually hear, feel, and see firsthand what it's like when that auto inflate PFD auto inflates. It's shocking, actually. And it's one of the reasons why the Coast Guard does not approve auto inflate PFDs for the youngest folks, because, well, for one, there is the incredible shock of it. I think I imagine our toddlers way back when we could get them for kids would have freaked out. But the other is that if it doesn't go off automatically, of course, can a child manually do that? Probably not.
Yeah, it's worth, if you haven't done that, to buy a spare inflation cylinder for a life jacket, put it in and go out and jump in the water and see what that looks like.
Use it before you replace one that's going to expire.
Yeah.
And then how about jumping in and trying to manually inflate it while you're in the water? Realize how much more difficult it would be for a child to think twice about whether or not a child should have an auto inflate.
Another way, just simple practice, especially with kids. With kids on a boat, you don't want to do things that are scary. Safety at sea is this delicate balance between drilling a little bit, but doing it in a fun way. So we had our kids walking around the boat with harness and tethers on and crawling and handholds, and we would have them run around the boat and go to find each fire extinguisher and pull it off and turn it over to listen to make sure the powder was not compacted inside. Little things like that help them gain familiarity with these things. To practice putting on their harnesses and tethers in the dark. It was a fun game for them, but it also helped improve their skill and ability should we ever have an emergency where we had to do that sort of thing. So another procedural type is documented procedures. These are things that we write out. You might write out a man overboard, person overboard. You might write out how to address a fire situation or whatever you want. It can be writing out how to change your oil so that you, or a fuel filter. So if you're in the pass between Bali and Lombok and the 6 knots of current and you have bad fuel and you're drifting as your engine cuts out, like we experienced. If you're panicked about changing that filter to get it back in time, you might have a procedure. There are some limitations to documented procedures, though. What they do well is they bring order from disorder. They make this organized way to see things, especially if somebody needs a list or if they're a little bit panicky, they can focus on this documented procedure to then go through these steps, and it can be very calming to have that.
One of the great techniques we've seen on some boats is to actually have a number of their procedures documented and typed out or written out on index cards or larger pieces of paper, laminate, hole punch, put it on a ring, and then hang that up near the companionway so anyone can access them. There may be a particular crew member who knows that they need those. It might be useful for guests. We've had folks that we've worked with do that for even basic get to know your boat things, like what are all the steps that we go through before we're going to jive? Because when that is new to you, you don't want to forget a single step. And that review can be really helpful before you actually go out and execute.
Yeah, if you forget to take the check stay off and you jive, it can end very badly. Documented procedures are also very helpful for the less experienced people. If you've got crew on board visiting family members, and you have these things,
You give them a reference.
Go through a safety briefing and show these things and let them go through them. The downside to documented procedures is that the variables in a real experience may differ from the reality that you have. And it means that you might have to think differently outside of the box to address a situation. And also that stress in a real situation can cause you to drift from a procedure. You may be distracted trying to read the procedure and trying to address the problem, especially people that get a little bit more excited in a stressful situation. So understand pros and cons to documented procedures. These are a couple of examples. The person overboard one is one I found that was from a ship's procedural guidebook, basically for the crew. This is a very flow chart, professional way of approaching it. And the one on the left is something I wrote for Totem as a way to pop up if we had any serious VHF. So if you're stressed on the VHF, there's a procedure that's written out to do that well.
Making sure you don't forget a step, making sure you cover not just where you are and where you're headed, but all the other things that are happening, people on board, having your MIDFI number
Don't forget
handy.
to say your name. All right, and the next one, don't forget that things like these are documented procedures, medical guides, cruising guides. Cruising guide is a documented procedure on information about your destination. That's what they are. These are really valuable resources.
And these are a handful of our favorites. We actually met Dr. Behan, the Yellow Book, the author of that, a couple of times while we were cruising. Last saw him in the Bahamas. He had written this along the way, but the book now benefits from a circumnavigation, not just decades of sailing. And then where there is no doctor, because it's so great for the tropical illnesses that we tend to see in common cruising boats.
We've been fortunate to have very few medical issues along the way, but in Mexico a couple of years ago offshore, on a just simple overnight passage, our son came up and he was in huge pain.
Yeah, just gray.
And
he'd lost his color just from the pain from coping with it.
Described the pain, and we sat him down. We went back to our documented procedures in a medical book, and we diagnosed that he probably had a kidney stone, and we got in as quick as we could, and it turns out he had a kidney stone. Great to have these sorts of resources on the boat. Documented procedures that somebody else did for you.
That's right.
Okay, another one. This one is hugely important. Post-mortem or debrief. This is the thing that professional mariners do, that police, law enforcement, military, when they go out, sports teams, after they have a day where they're playing or an event happens for police or the military,
and you rehash it. What happened?
What worked? What did we do well? What did we fail on? What could we improve on? This is how we get to be better sailors, is we talk about it. So you go in and you anchor in the Bahamas and it didn't go the way you thought. And yes, you might not be talking about to each other until you've had a glass of wine each, and then you start talking to each other. We've all been there, that's fine. But once you are, at some point, talk about the event. Because if you ignore it, it's going to happen again, and you're not going to get beyond it. Usually it's simple communication things, but it can be, I thought that you meant this and I did that. And so maybe it's figuring out how to communicate better using more appropriate hand gestures, not those kind of hand gestures. Um, the postmortem is an exceptional way to get better at this thing, because next time it'll be more familiar and you'll have a better outcome. The downside to them is memory isn't perfect. Sometimes you may remember things differently, and it can feel like you're pointing finger,
Right.
and it feels, and truth hurts sometimes. And the point of these is not about laying blame. It's about moving ahead.
Understanding outcomes so that this next one won't happen.
It's about getting better. And this is what we have to accept and to do to be better sailors. Here's an example. This next picture was about sailing to Hawaii a couple of years ago. They sent this picture in, and they dismasted on the way there. And they blamed the rigger. The rigging was fairly new. It was within a year. And it was a pretty traumatic experience. And they were sure that the rigging was failed and they were going to sue the rigger. And we went through the whole experience. I had them list out everything that went on and talk about it and to write about it. And in that, details came out that effectively it was a squall. They lost control of the boat. The headsail was pulled out, so it was locked out off the side of the boat, but they rounded up. So the sail was being backed in the squall. The rig was shaking violently. And it turns out they replaced the standing rigging mostly as commonly done, wire and swages, but they didn't get all of the the toggles. And at the masthead, and I could tell by the way the rig fell over, it was the backstay and it was at the toggle at the masthead. And they, after doing a little checking, confirmed that that toggle was not replaced. So only by debriefing were they able to understand how this thing went wrongly, and that it was in fact human error, not the rigger's human error. Or maybe it was, because maybe you should have done that.
Maybe you should have done the toggle. And
but there are other choices, and who knows about that.
Yeah.
The point is they figured it out, they moved on, they re-rigged, and they're still out sailing today. This one is a little bit unusual, the pre-mortem. The post-mortem is...
Because we don't want to have a crisis to figure out how to learn from it and move on, right? So how do you learn from a situation that might occur and try to avoid having it happen in the first place, or recovering from it more easily if it does happen?
How do you prepare for dismasting? If you've not been dismasted, how do you do that? Or losing the rudder, or a whole pile of other situations that happen. You really can't, and we don't have any virtual training like pilots do, like military do. So a very effective way, although it sounds goofy, is in this virtual training where you literally set yourself up in a quiet place. I would do this on passages, not knowing this was a thing, but it turns out this pre-mortem or virtual training is a real thing that people can do and do professionally even. And what you do is sit down, quiet, where you're not disturbed, and you think about the situations that stress you out. Okay, somebody falling overboard. Oh my God, I don't know what to do. And it keeps me up at night because we're now 3 months from departing to go cruising. Well, instead of letting that own you, figure out how you can respond to it. Say, okay, well, if it happened, I would stop the boat. I would turn around. I would get the sails down. And that's the start of a procedure. And keep going through and refining. Do some research. How else can I improve the way that I respond to this situation? And by doing this over and over and over again, not just in one sitting, but in multiple times, you'll own the experience. And if that situation does ever happen, you'll be familiar with it in a way to respond much better. I like the idea that boats have steering. Steering helps the boat go where you want it to go. And I think it's a good feature. And so I did this virtual training, not knowing it was a thing, about going through our steering system. What would happen if we ever had a steering failure? And we were off Thailand, lumpy, bumpy conditions. And all of a sudden we heard a bang. and then the wheel wasn't steering anymore. It was kind of rolling back and forth. And instantly, I had been through this situation so many times in my head on night watch and quiet times that I knew what I was going to do. The first thing is run back, open the lazarette, put the emergency tiller in place, while also trying to make sure situational awareness. Is the boat going to round up? What's happening with the boat? I noticed that we were still steering straight. So to me, it's like, okay, the autopilot's in play. We haven't lost the rudder. There's something in the steering mechanism. But going through this process and having this familiarity, I diagnosed and found that the linkage bolt between the quadrant and the steering cables sheared off and broke. And I had this fixed in about 3 minutes with a piece of Dyneema because of that familiarity with it. You can do this with any number of possible failures. This is the bolt that broke. That's the Dyneema. Situation under control in about 3 minutes. So virtual training, it is very, very effective way to get familiar with stressful things and to own that experience.
Where did you harvest that Dyneema from?
There's Dyneema everywhere. It's getting around.
We do. It's all over the place on Totem.
Okay, and here's another one. It's a little bit unusual, but this is one that that professional sailors do. I'm sure it's done in other sports as well, and stressful roles, military, where they're going through professional training for
Like a single-handed round the world cruise.
Yeah.
Cruise individual.
and it's a way to if you feel your mind spinning out, you feel your panic elevating towards panic situation, that you recognize this and use these tricks that you train for to get back control of the situation. It's a way to regain control. The downside to this is it sounds like woo. It sounds like, voodoo.
Mind control.
Mind control.
Sure.
But here's the deal. Let's go ahead one. This is a great example. This is Alex Thompson, a professional single-handed offshore racing sailor on his boat Hugo Boss. And this is extreme sailing in a boat like this, where it can be in the Southern Ocean doing 30 knots down 30-foot waves and blowing 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, dealing with these situations. And it's not that he doesn't get stressed. So he did an article about this and he said, I get terrified out there sometimes, but if I lose control, if I go into panic, it can really go badly. And he's trained with a psychiatrist ways to regain that control. And this is, maybe you've seen
Obviously,
him do
cool
this
as
one.
cucumber.
Cool as cucumber, but inside the heart beats fast for all of us at times. And here's an example. He did this stunt for PR where they heeled the boat way over, walked up to the top of the mast, and there was a kiteboard rigged at the top of the mast, and jumped off and got trailed behind the boat while it's sailing along at 18 or 20 knots. Crazy, insane stuff. He must be 130 feet in the air there. But a couple of things that he mentioned doing is, he said when he starts to get stressed at a situation, like there's huge waves, he said, I find a place where I imagine myself slowly pulling back from Earth in a safe way on like a balloon, hot air balloon or an airplane. And I'm getting further away and things look smaller and smaller and smaller. And so those waves that are huge when I'm staring right at them begin to shrink up and they look more controllable. And it helps me get my heart rate down and get my head around the situation. Another one that he does is he makes friends with ghosts. So people that were his mentors and idols, professional sailors before him, that were in these same situations but made it. Robin Knox Johnson or Ellen MacArthur or any of these, Laura Decker.
Could we invoke Slocum and his ghost
Joshua
captain?
Slocum and his ghost captain, absolutely. And he would literally start into this imaginary conversation with them to help bring peace back to himself. And if they sound goofy, but we've both done this. Again, not knowing is a thing until doing more research for safety at sea classes, but it's a thing to do this. So give it a try. All right, we're going to talk about through a response framework for stressful situations. So something happens out there, and the first thing that you should do in a stressful situation, something happens, boom, a flash response. And the idea of a flash response, because oftentimes in a real quick, a boom happens. In this situation, we were sailing from Bermuda to Connecticut and being smelled smoke. And in that flash response, you're assessing how quickly do I need to respond. Overwhelmingly, we don't need to respond to a situation within seconds. And this is really important. If something happens that needs your attention, and if you jump right to it, the chance that you're going to trip and fall and smash your head, get knocked out, these stories happen out there, is so much higher. And most of the time, you don't need to respond that quickly.
On this occasion, however, we did have to respond very, very quickly.
But we did it really in a controlled way. We jumped up, oh my God, we smelled smoke. We got our son to start getting the first aid or the ditch kit ready and the life raft. Behan and I ran around tearing stuff up in the boat. We found the source. Water got in and it burned out. Charge controller. The fuse blew, so the situation was gone. There was no fire, but it was super stressful. But mostly, you don't have to respond in a hasty, rapid, out of control way. The point of the flash response is to just say, yes, I need an instantaneous response, or I can stop and think about this a little bit more. And that's mostly the case, is you can stop, even if it's 30 seconds, you're gonna have a more reasoned response.
Such as our early story about our friend heading out from Panama and losing his rig a couple days out.
Yep.
I'm sorry, not losing his rig, losing the D2.
Almost losing the rig, and stop and think, oh my God, what's the situation? And we've been in them, like when our steering failed, and you're fuzzy in that moment. What just happened? Even though you know what happened because you heard it, there's confusion for some seconds. So flash assessment, then stop and reassess and think about it. And okay, now I have to remember I'm going to box this problem. I'm not going to run forward. I'm not going to have a super fast rash reaction that's going to risk more danger. We're going to think about this before we have a response. And then reassess what you think your response is. A lot of times we have more time than we think. And when we've had tough or risky situations that we needed a response to, rescuing a boat or helping a dragging boat, it's think through a couple times, what's my plan? Let me go through that again. And my second version is better than my first version. And in this, talk about the plan so that the crew and other people that maybe are panicky, by talking about it in this, what's the plan? What are we going to do? They're starting to, rather than panic, get mentally tied into a plan of action. They have something they can grasp onto and rationalize rather than fear turning into panic. And I have more stories about each of these, but we're not going to do them because we're running on time.
We're getting long. That is a great story, though.
And
almost sinking on a reef in Papua New Guinea. Hit us up later
not,
for it.
Not us, another boat.
Yeah, not us.
And then get into a safe response. Think things through. So we went down the ICW, and our mast was too tall, and it was only barely too tall, but we didn't want the risk of hitting and getting stuck. And so we thought through, and we created this pole, vinyl or PVC pole on top of the mast.
PVC pipe that Jamie literally has duct taped on the front of the mast there. And we sort of jokingly named that the pig stick. As you know, the pig stick is that staff at the top of the mast that we use for a pennant or burgee. And that, because it was duct taped on relatively loosely, that meant that we could approach more safely with a signal that would cue us into the possible problem with getting under a bridge on the ICW.
And the kids were on the end of the boom because we literally had to heel by calculations, all thought through, 4 degrees of heel to safely get under the bridge. And when the water had blown in, we actually tapped the bridge with the pig stick and just backed out slowly.
We've got everything off the boom here. In addition to the kids, there's, spare anchor, our outboard, a bunch of tools, a jerry can full of water.
But it was the kids that did it, especially that 60-pound.
They got us that extra debris that we needed.
But safe response. I've been in a lot of situations where boats are dragging and needing help, and there's kind of a frantic response of people in dinghies that actually gets to be more dangerous, and the potential for
not making a coordinated response, trying to help, but actually
adding risk to the whole experience. Next one. Okay, building in safety. So this is a quick pass because I know we're just up on our hour here. Training. If you're going to go cruising, what training can you get? These are this is a procedural response, really. is by learning to understand medical situations, improve your knowledge about these things, or a firefighting class if you want to do. There's lots of ways to get official train or proper training, like safety at sea class, like this one. Hopefully you come away and think, I can address or step into a situation a little bit more knowledgeable about it because of training that you sought out. Resources on board.
Having the medical kit, having the references, having the
Tools.
documents, whatever those things are that you need to be able to address your situation, having thought through them and having that cash.
Not all duct tape is created equally. Seasickness. This is one that is, if you know you get seasick, figure
And this
out.
one doesn't actually, but maybe it's because she says
No, she's got an iron stomach. She has her peaceful place. But if you do get seasick, maybe take meds before you get going. Learn what meds work. Try, make the situation better. If you're not sure you get seasick, don't just go offshore saying, well, I don't get car sick, so I'm sure I'm fine, because it's different for everyone. And I know so many stories of people that get out there and they get way more seasick, and it's debilitating. And when you have a seasick crew member,
they take out another crew member because you need someone one-on-one to make sure that they're okay. So one seasick crew does not mean you're down one person. It can mean you're down two people.
That's right. So give it attention if it needs to be looked into more. Test your safety gear. This was getting ready to cross the Indian Ocean, and we inflated our PFDs, and the next morning, manually inflated them. The next morning, the one on the right wasn't holding air anymore. It was mine, and I thought, okay, that's probably not the PFD we want to cross the notorious Indian Ocean with.
Time for a trip to Singapore. Jamie actually flew down and picked up some new gear at the other end of the peninsula.
EPIRBs, PLBs, jack lines that sit in the sun, all of these things. Give them attention. Batteries that you have in your ditch kit. These are the things that you do hands-on preventatively to make sure they work when you need them to. And know your boat. When you're at anchor in a marina and it's nice and calm, know those deep, dark spaces in the boat so that when you have that weird noise in the middle of the night, you're not sure what it is, you can probably figure it out by the type of sound because you've gotten really familiar with your boat. Go up the rig, get into the bilge, in the lazarette, all these places. Guests and young crew aboard, when when you've got guests aboard, spend time and do a safety brief with them. Talk about your expectations, not just with how the toilet works, although that's the first lesson with guests.
Always.
But it's like, okay, if it's these conditions, we wear life jackets. And in the dinghy, we maybe do this.
Being clear on expectations and how important it is to follow direction.
And this way everybody's on the same page up front. File a float plan. We feel that this one often gets overlooked, but if you're going offshore, you ought to have a float plan, somebody who is aware of what you're doing and
someone who's entrusted with these plans and will take the right course of action to contact on an escalating basis if needed.
And somebody that's not panicky, because you don't want to be half a day late and then call the Coast Guard to come out looking for you because you're half a day late.
We typically entrust our float plan to two people. They know about each other, and one is that person that cares deeply about us and really wants to be able to stay dialed into everything and every move and have that ownership. But the other is a person that is a friend but doesn't maybe have as deep that a connection with us, and so someone we can count on to be cool and collected in the case of a true emergency.
Know your destinations and what the risks are. So this is in the Maldives. Understand them before you arrive, because when you arrive, you might be really tired and groggy.
And in this case, of course, it's entering a lagoon that is absolutely strewn with coral heads. And we've got Nile up on the bow and our pre-established signal plan to be able to maneuver and avoid the bombies, as we call them, on the way in.
And know whether he's pointing on the safe path or where the coral is, because if you get that confused, it doesn't go well. Be weather smart. This is as important as all of them. There are some amazing weather resources out there and weather routers, and do this well. And it's very likely you'll never experience really nasty weather, and that you'll minimize the uncomfortable days in the water. Resources are so good now if they're used well. and they're easily used incorrectly. Get weather smart. And then safe practices. Harnesses, tether, clip in, have pre-made meals before a bigger passage. So if somebody's not feeling well, it's easy to eat and stay filled up with energy.
Mhm.
Be well
Keeping that
stowed,
energy up is
secured.
critical.
All of
Mhm.
these things are safe practices. In the end, safety at sea is a collection of tools and techniques for faulty humans to assess, communicate, and manage risk. So never stop collecting. Um, we've been at it and we have some good experience, but we're always looking for new ways to improve this. And I think everybody else ought to be as well.
And with that, concludes the planned portion of the presentation. There's a link here. If you visit that, you'll be able to download a PDF that includes all of the slides from today. And as noted, they're not super data intensive, but they might help you remember some of the techniques that we've talked about today. And feel free to follow up with us directly. If there's anything that you want to learn, Jamie's email is on there. I know we're happy to take questions through the chat. One of them did come through earlier that we didn't get to address fully, and we'll take a sec to do that now. But with regard to, it was the D2 that was lost on Itchyfoot, actually. And how did you advise them to stabilize their rig? And what was the material that they used if they had Dyneema on?
So based on the location of that rigging failure, the first thing that I thought that they could do was get their topping lift or a halyard for an inner forestay pulled off to the side to help stabilize it. And they were able to do that, but it was stretchy lines, so it only minimally had that effect. They of course had reduced sail area very quickly. Unfortunately, it wasn't very windy. But then the next trick was to get Dyneema. They had some Dyneema, but to get it up and attached roughly in the right place. And this was a little bit tricky to do, but they were able to uh, basically pull the Dyneema length up with the topping lift and then use that to secure. So even though topping lift was in part of that loop, the Dyneema was much less stretchy. And so they could get that into place. And then they were able to get an additional Dyneema line in place to make it done, to make it stable. And it took them 4 days motoring back to get to Panama with a stable enough rig that they made it.
And what kind of Dyneema, what size do you think is good carrying on board?
6 millimeter, a 1/4 inch Dyneema is incredibly versatile. It's got a braking strength of about 8,600 pounds. So you can lift a couple of cars with those things with one line. 1/4 inch Dyneema, it's lightweight, it fits in a plastic bag. You can
We typically get it by the spool for a better price and then just continually use it for projects.
Or for rigging with other people's boats and things. But I think it's a good idea to, if you're going far offshore, to have a spare stay that's equal to the longest length of on the boat. And that would be bigger than a 1/4 inch. That would be appropriate for whatever the biggest stay diameter is that you have in Dyneema or Dynex ducts. Tiny little small thing. Don't carry around an old stainless steel wire as your spare stay. They don't like to be coiled up in the bilge for years. When they pull out straight, the stainless steel doesn't love that. And it's heavy and it's awkward to use. So
we carried one for a long time.
We did until Dyneema was more of a thing. Dyneema or Dynex ducts are exceptional resources on a boat. We broke our steering chain off of Australia and ended up splicing into the new end of the chain with a Dyneema length of line and replacing the whole cable, and did 5,000 miles that way. Very versatile. 1/4 inch Dyneema, a spool is usually about 600 feet, so it's a lot.
I was gonna say 50 meters.
Even more.
Yeah.
So I recommend in the beginning, maybe buy 50-foot length, 100-foot length, learn how to splice it. It's very easy to splice, and it's rewarding. Learn how to do soft shackles if you want, but it's always great to have some on hand. Super versatile.
Any other questions that we can help with? We're happy to stick around for a little bit and do Q&A.
And if somebody wants to unmute and do a live question, that's fine too. Hopefully I haven't scared everybody. Often when I do my safety at sea class, I even have a lot more scary stories when I do the 3-hour version.
Yeah.
And sometimes people come out shell shocked.
Yeah, this is a shortened version of a more in-depth seminar, but it really hits on all of the high points or all of the key points in terms of what are those important ways to think through preparing, and how can we prepare when we're not professional mariners and we don't have that regular certification and drilling and tools to anticipate that professional mariners have.
And accountability. At the end of the day, if you're on a working on a commercial ship, if you mess up or somebody messes up, it's addressed at the end of the watch or the day. It's reviewed, it's reported on. And the bad docking event at the end of the day, when we're not talking to each other for a little bit afterwards, that's not adequate. We need to talk about it. So,
and if anyone wants to know more about that pre-mortem technique too, hit us up by email. If you, well, there's Jamie's email there, or if you go through and sign up for slides, you get notifications for our future talks later. You can just hit reply and ask. But there's a TED talk about this as well. It's not remotely nautical, but it talks through basically the same technique, and it could be another way to think about how to bring that into practice on your boat. And with that, Barb, thank you. Thank you so much. We appreciate being here, getting to share some scary and not so scary stories from our experience to help folks prepare for safety at sea.
Well, thank you so much, Behan and Jamie. This was wonderful information. I know everyone really appreciate you sharing with them. And if there are no other questions, I guess we'll come to an end here. We do have another Salty Dog webinar tomorrow. It is Heavy Air Tactics and Strategy with David Flynn from Quantum Sales. So hope to see a lot of you here tomorrow. And again, thank you so much to Sailing Totem.
Our pleasure. Thanks everybody.
Guys.
Bye now.
Have a good night.